Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates. In the previous video, I talked about not only about the political forms of rule earlier, but the second video I dealt with the distinction between the earliest forms of rule of household forming tribes, empire of one tribe or ruling clan conquering another one, and the emergence of the political community as the polis. In this video, I'm going to talk about the distinction between the ancient form of the political community and the modern form of the political community, the state. The ancient form of the polis emerged out of this, out of a situation where you had a heterogeneous population, and that the imperial form was no longer very possible. But at the same time, reverting to tribes made no sense. The rise of the polis was that you had people who lived together, and the idea was, well, wait a minute, this is not a tribe. You're not my kin. You're not my kin blood. You're not my there. How do we? And this is more than economics. It is something more than the fact that we exchange our services. I buy milk from you. You buy your grain from me. That there's something more than mere economic activity. We live together, and we need each other to live together in order to be able to protect each other. Therefore, we see each other as something more than strangers or people who are different who exchange with each other. It's more than an exchange society. It becomes something that a community. The Greek word is koinonia, something in common. We have something in common. We share an interest together in common. We see each other as common. And this polis is understood as a form of rule where the members who constitute it kind of join a joint partnership. Some people will say koinonia is a partnership. That's a problematic term in that sense. Because partnership implies a complete voluntary structure. This is not completely voluntary in the sense that you are born here. People are born in this situation. You might not have chosen to be here. Sometimes you might choose. You might not like this place, so you go over to someplace else. So therefore, the polis is in some ways involuntary, but in some ways voluntary. And the fact that it is this mixture of this that makes it very interesting. The other element of what's so interesting about the polis that distinguishes, that defines it, it will take elements of empire, language, law, religion that was formed in these imperial structures. And also, it will further it. In some ways, it will use the tools of empire, but will operate at the level like its tribe, but not be a tribe because it is not as homogeneous or kin-based. In other words, although a polis could be homogeneous, but membership of the polis is not a question of being of the same blood or the same kin. Rather, it is sharing a same life together. Whereas family, it's a much more difficult question because you're born into it. The polis, you may be born into it, or you may join it, or you may form it, and maybe become a member. And the ones who become members are, some places will be seen as equal members, or as equal members as someone who's born into it. So it has the possibility of being heterogeneous as well as homogeneous. Now, the classical polis was thus limited by size, small size. And by 20,000, 15,000 population of active citizens. It was limited by its participation of this. Now, this limit of the political, this is where the political happened, where that's people who are able to actively engage in being citizen, ruling and being ruled, was determined by the things that we call communication, the ability to speak and understand. Human politics rests on talk, rests on speech. It rests on the ability to persuade. Unlike other animals who communicate through other means of either ants with that chemical signals, bees, we communicate our messages through speech and complex speech, and thus we can convey not only feelings and things, but also ideas or concepts, and that we're able to judge and evaluate them. Thus, the ability to understand and see each other and know each other is limited by our biological natures. It's, how many friends can you really have in real life to associate? The typical situation is most of us can easily know or being able to interact with around 120 or 150 people. Thus, in an enclosed area, one would conceive that it is possible that a society of 15,000 to 20,000 people would be at the maximum limit with having at least 1, 2, 3 levels of interaction with. In other words, you have a first immediate of 120, and of those 120, they have 120, and the next level of degrees of difference, at least 3 to 4 degrees of difference, could basically build the basis by which a community could see each other as the same group sharing the same thing. Now, the classical city was overcome by another empire, an empire that both in Alexander and by Caesar, by Rome. Rome was a city, a polis, a civitas as the Romans would call it, who conquered other cities and behaved imperially. Like Athens ruled over its league as though, the Athenian League, as though it was despotically, as an empire would. Therefore, a city, a polis, could become the engine that created an empire. And it did. And what happened was, in this case, this new version, this political empire, took control and dominated over the knowing polis. This then led to a problem. When this new political empire, Rome, conquered much of the world, much of the European world, the polis no longer could compete as a form. And because of this, the polis ceased being the form. Even though the basis of political rule was a polis governing and ruling over the empire. Now, this led to, when the empire itself, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed, what replaced it was not just that. There's a very complex problem. The complex problem is the emergence of all these different forms of rule. We must remember that the Roman Empire, when Christianity came to be powerful, the Roman Empire, and particularly with the Emperor Constantine, took Christianity in. But once the empire ended in the West, the church was an important social function that held people together and organized themselves and had power. So therefore you had the church, you had the collapsed structures where households merge. The feudal period of the Middle Ages was a period of these multiple forms of political rule, being that of a household governing over people in a feudal relationship, be it cities that emerged as that survived and developed and asserted their authority, or people who wanted the empire back, new versions or modified versions of it, like the emperor, like the king, the Frankish king did it, or tribal leaders, ethnic tribal leaders asserting their authority, utilizing these networks of feudal structures to establish themselves as gang leaders and rulers of the thing. But this world was a mess. And in the 15th century, this created chaos with all these competing forms of political rule competing for each other, led to a situation where, there was not really any effective way to bring stability or order for these competing rules. And each one of these forms sought to dominate over the other forms. And this led to the crisis of the situation in the 14th and 15th century, which emerges with the birth of the state. Machiavelli coins the conception of the state, and the state is understood as a product of the human will. And unlike the city, which was natural, a product of human being and becoming human within a community, the city was understood, the state was understood as an instrument of the prince's will in order to bring new modes and orders to create something new. It was a product of the prince's will. in order to give orders and structures to make a new form that would be able to be more effective and have the ability to conquer the defects that nature provided man, to allow man to achieve stability and peace that the nature itself did not provide for man. So thus, the state becomes the new model, the modern form of the political form. Now, the trajectory of the state would vary from Machiavelli's understanding of it being an instrument of the prince's will, a tool or thing that the prince will use. A prince, either be it a prince or a republican, a set of rulers running a republic. In other words, a republic would be a body of ruling families or rulers that form the city space, and that a city thus could, or civics order, could use the new state as a tool as much as an individual ruler, an ambitious man could to assert the rule. And Machiavelli's understanding of this, and this idea that it's an instrument, is evolved later by someone like Thomas Hobbes, who fundamentally changes the Machiavellian structure from an instrument to that the state itself is the collective whole of the constitutive parts, all the people or all the members that organize and constitute it. They become the state. They form and make the state. And that the territory that they have that belongs to those people, that the members who constitute it, becomes the territory of the state. And that therefore this becomes the modern conception. So therefore, one of the biggest problems in this, as political scientists, is that we have a problem. And that problem is that we tend to impose back into the past the concept of the state. We attribute it to the Greek city. We speak of the city, the polis, as a city-state. And in doing so, we fail to realize that the polis and the state are nothing in common in terms of its nature and character. It's even its logic. The state has no limit to it in the sense that the state is a product of the human willing agency. And as long as the members can agree, the only limit to the state is the willingness of the members to agreement to form it. That as long as those who agreed to form it, those who agreed to compose it, to constitute it, and their willingness to authorize and establish it, that is all that's required. So therefore, there's only a pragmatic or practical limit to what a given body or group will agree to that limits the possibility or size of the state. That is not true with the polis. The polis is dictated by the limits of nature, whereas the state is not limited by nature, but only the human will, and knowing the human will is infinite. Thus, the difference between our ancient political conception of this natural form and the medieval one, where there's this mass of varieties and forms that maybe in the Greek world would not see as political. The Greeks, Aristotle himself, did not see the nation as a political form. In fact, the nation only becomes a political form because of the instrumentality of the state. The state makes the nation politically viable. The Greeks, that was not seen possible. The tribe was not a viable political form. It was not as effective or political in its characteristic. The state takes the tribe, the nation, and makes it a political entity. And with that, we see the difference between the ancient polis versus the modern state. Thank you very much.